Martin Wolf, your sense of the impact of the conflict in the Middle East having on an economy like India's?
Yes, I think what has just been said seems to me reasonably plausible. Of the large net oil importing economies, India is, I think, in a relatively good position to withstand the shock. The US, of course, uniquely among the really big economies, is not a net importer, and it's sort of a fortress. But we leave that aside. India's real estate cycle indeed has turned around. The financial sector seems, from what I've seen, I wrote about this in July, in pretty good shape. There seems to be a fair amount of animal spirits. It's a large country with a large domestic market. Trade is more important than it used to be, but not that important. So barring some really big global catastrophe, I would have thought India is in a pretty good position to survive. But all I would stress is these scenarios I put forward are very iffy. I think the small and medium one are pretty well defined. But if we do get into a situation when there is our major hostilities in the Gulf itself involving Iran, possibly be prepared to lash out at other countries in the Gulf, then the consequences could conceivably be a bigger disruption than we've ever seen before in oil flows. And if that happens, the global implications are get into a territory we just haven't experienced. And it's a tail risk. I think it's a very small tail risk, but it's there, and one has to take this into account in one's planning, particularly for a country, a big country like India.
Your colleague Gideon Rachman was with us yesterday, and one of the things he spoke about was the disconcerting similarities between what happened in June 1914 with the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo, and how, despite the global powers at that time not wanting confrontation, within a few weeks all the major European powers were at war, and then so was the United States, and then we had what's now called World War I. How much of a concern is that for you? How much of that hangs over the US, over the global economy, that if Iran and Israel were to be militarily involved, it may not necessarily just stay restricted there. There's also, in that axis of resistance, Russia, potentially even China, and it could get far more complicated. Martin Wolf.
It seems to me that that's obviously the worst scenario, and if you look at human history, one can never rule out the possibility of completely mad behavior in this sort of a tit-for-tat situation when neither side wants to back down. But my view is it's a very low risk, not zero, but a very low risk. The people leading the US and China are aware of it. Their vital interests are not at stake here to any overwhelming extent. They want to keep peace. War would be devastating for all parties. Nothing could be achieved by it. Remember, we have nuclear weapons. And I think Russia has enough on its plate right now in Ukraine, to put it mildly, not to want to get actually into another military confrontation, potentially with the US. So my guess is this is a remote possibility. It's definitely not zero, but the plausible assumption is it will be avoided.
One of the global headlines of the past several months has been the growing confrontation and competition between the United States and China. We're now seeing some signs of a thaw, with the White House confirming a meeting between President Biden and Xi Jinping later this month, even though the Chinese haven't spoken about it. How do you see a possible rapprochement, even if it's just very marginal, but nonetheless not a worsening of ties between the United States and China, impact the global growth story? Martin Wolf.
I think there's no question, my colleague Edward Luce has also written about this, that the Americans and I believe the Chinese are really quite keen to cool the temperature. And the way they're trying to do that is to generate a certain amount of precision about what they intend to do, what they don't intend to do, so that the sort of big loose words that have been used in the past about relations between the US and China disappear from the American debate, and the Chinese, they hope, will respond. And this is obviously a very powerful vested interest in both countries in this. This is a confrontation, if it gets significantly worse, that neither side is going to benefit from economically, let alone militarily. So I think it's very, very likely that we're going to see this turn into a manageable conflict. We're at an early stage of this. I still remember very, very well the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there were stages in the 60s when there were really big worries about the relations with the US and the Soviet Union, which were in many ways ideologically more confrontational. And yet they did manage to manage that peacefully, at least in terms of direct confrontation, and I expect that to happen again. Provided that's the case, there will be real economic costs from the decoupling, or the partial de-risking, as it's now called, of relations between the US and China, but barring actual military confrontation or a complete breakdown in economic relations, I think they will be manageable.